October 12, 1888. The new owner of the mercantile and boarding house, a nephew from back east with soft hands and a harder ledger, pointed to her trunk and bedroll on the dirt street. They sat beside a small stack of books, a canvas sack of tools, and a crate containing her kitchen essentials. He did not need to speak. The gesture was enough. Audrey watched him turn and close the door, the latch clicking with a sound of finality that echoed in the thin mountain air. Her dog, a golden retriever named Sully, nudged his head against her hand, his tail giving one uncertain thump against her leg. She looked down the main street of Prosperity, a name that felt like a cruel joke written in peeling paint on the false-fronted buildings. Men watched from the saloon porch, their curiosity a dull, silent wait. She had worked at the boarding house for 2 years, since arriving with little more than she had now. The previous owner, Mr. Abernathy, had been fair. He had paid her a wage and let her keep a room. His nephew saw only an expense. She had $10 in a leather pouch, her final pay, and the deed to a 5-acre plot of land 2 miles outside of town, left to her by a distant uncle she'd never met. It was described in the deed as unimproved timber land. She had walked it once. It was a steep slope of lodgepole pine and aspen, with a small, clear creek cutting through the lowest corner. It had no shelter. Not even a flat place to pitch a tent. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks that ringed the valley, a stark white warning against the deep blue of the sky. Winter was not coming, it was waiting. The sun began its descent, pulling long, cold shadows from the buildings. Audrey did not ask for help. She did not look for pity in the faces that watched her. She simply began to organize her life where it had landed. She loaded her belongings onto a small handcart she'd purchased from the blacksmith for 50 cents. She pushed it out of town, Sully trotting quietly beside her, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding a rhythm into the dusty road. By the time she reached her parcel of land, the last light was a faint orange line behind the western mountains. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She made a simple camp, a lean-to against a large granite boulder using her bedroll canvas. She built a small fire, feeding it with dry sticks gathered from the forest floor. Sully lay with his head on his paws, watching the flames. She ate a piece of hardtack and some dried beef, then opened a small, leather-bound notebook. In the flickering firelight, she began a list. First, assets: 1 dog, 5 acres of timber, 1 axe, 1 saw, 1 adze, 1 auger, various small tools. $10. Below that, she wrote liabilities: no shelter, no food stores, winter 3 weeks away. The most critical liability, the one that could kill her faster than cold or hunger, was fuel. She could cut wood, but keeping it dry was the true problem. Where wood was just frozen smoke. A winter's supply of firewood, cut and stacked, would be a small mountain. A conventional woodshed was a miniature cabin, requiring notched logs, a planked roof, and time she did not have. It also required skill she was still acquiring and money she did not possess. She closed the notebook, the smooth leather cool against her palm. The wind moved through the pines with a low moan. Sully lifted his head, a low growl in his throat, but it was only the wind. She looked up at the stars, brilliant and indifferent in the blackness. The problem was not the coming snow. The problem was the weight of it. The next morning, she walked the land not as an owner, but as a student. She carried no tools, only her notebook and a piece of charcoal. Sully ranged ahead, his coat a spot of gold against the dark timber. She did not look for a flat place to build a cabin. A cabin was a luxury for another year, another life. She looked for patterns. She noted the direction of the prevailing wind by observing the lean of the older pines. She saw how the snow from the first dusting still lay thick on the north-facing slopes and had melted from the southern exposures. She followed the creek, watching the way the water flowed, and noticed the willows that grew along its banks. They were tough, pliant, bent into permanent arches from years of heavy snowpack pressing them down each winter, only for them to spring back, mostly, in the spring. They yielded to the weight, they did not fight it. She sat for an hour, just watching them. She made a sketch in her notebook, a long, low structure with a curved roof, like the hull of an overturned boat. It was a shape she had seen once before, in a sketch of a trapper's winter camp. Theirs were small, temporary things. Hers would need to be large, strong enough to shelter a winter's worth of firewood. She walked back up the slope and found a stand of young lodgepole pines, straight and tall, but no thicker than her arm at the base. They were green, full of sap. A traditional builder would never use them. Green wood twisted, shrank, and warped as it dried. It was unstable. But it was also flexible. She remembered a lesson from a man who had repaired wagons. He always used green hickory for the boughs that supported the canvas cover, bending them into shape and letting them cure into a permanent, strong curve. The flaw of the wood could be its strength, if you asked the right question of it. She returned to her camp and wrote in her notebook. Problem: snow is heavy. Solution: do not give it a flat place to sit. She drew the structure again, this time with measurements. 40 feet long, 10 feet wide, 7 feet high at the center of the arc. It would be a spine of bent wooden ribs, sunk into the earth. It seemed impossible. It also seemed like the only answer. She spent her first dollar on a ball of heavy tarred twine and a sharpening stone for her axe. The work began. Felling the young pines was the easy part. The saw sang through the soft wood, and the trees fell with a sighing crash. The harder work was preparing them. She limbed each one with her axe, leaving a long, clean pole. Then she began digging. She laid out the footprint of the structure, a long rectangle, and dug post holes every 4 feet down each of the long sides. They were 2 feet deep, dug with a shovel she'd bought in town for another 75 cents. The ground was rocky and unforgiving. By the end of the second day, her hands were raw, her back a knot of fire. But the holes were done. She sharpened the ends of thicker, straighter logs and drove them into the holes, creating 2 parallel walls of sturdy posts, each standing about 3 feet high. This would be the foundation, the anchor for the arches. Sully watched her, occasionally coming over to lick the sweat from her face. At the end of each day, she would sit by her fire and draw in her notebook, refining the design, making calculations. She was building not just from muscle, but from a plan that grew more detailed each night. On the 4th day, Mr. Finch, the town carpenter, rode up the trail on his way to check a timber claim. He was a man whose world was built of right angles and seasoned hardwood. He reined in his horse and watched her for a long time. She was trying to bend the first of the long, green poles, her feet braced against the base posts, her entire body straining to create the arch. "That's green pine," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Audrey paused, wiping her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She nodded. "It is." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near his horse's hoof. "It'll warp on you. Shrink and pull your joints apart before the first real snow. There's a reason we use seasoned lumber." He spoke without malice, stating a fact as he knew it. She looked at the pole in her hands, then back at him. She didn't offer an argument. "I need it to bend," she said. Mr. Finch shook his head slowly, a small, sad gesture. "It'll bend, all right. Then it'll break." He nudged his horse and continued up the trail, leaving her alone with his certainty. The doubt he planted was a cold seed, but she went back to work, pulling the pole down, lashing it to the opposite post with the tarred twine. The first rib of the skeleton was in place. It looked fragile, almost absurd against the backdrop of the massive, ancient pines. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Frost rimmed the edges of the creek each morning. Audrey worked from the first light to the last, a steady, relentless rhythm of labor. She bent and secured one arch after another, until the long spine of the structure was complete. It looked like the bleached ribs of some great animal that had died on the hillside. The green wood fought her, groaning and creaking in protest, but she used levers and her own body weight, slowly convincing each pole into its new shape. The work was a conversation with the wood, learning its tensions, its limits. She braced the arches with horizontal poles, lashing them tight, turning the collection of individual ribs into an interconnected frame. The structure gained a surprising rigidity. She could hang her full weight from the center of the spine and it would barely deflect. One afternoon, a different visitor appeared. An old man in buckskins, leading a mule loaded with traps. Abel, a trapper who spent his winters in the high country, was on his way to his trapping lines. He stopped and stared at her creation, his weathered face unreadable. Sully, who barked at most strangers, simply watched him, tail still. Abel walked around the structure, his eyes narrowed in assessment. He kicked one of the base posts. He ran a hand over a lash joint. "What's this for?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "To keep my firewood dry," she said. He grunted. He looked up, not at her structure, but past it, to the snow-covered peaks. "That snow up there ain't the snow you get down here. Up there, it's powder. Light. Down here, the first big storms bring wet snow. Heavy as wet cement. I've seen it snap the ridge poles of cabins built by good men." He pointed a gnarled finger at the curved roofline. "A heavy snow will find the flat spot on top of that curve. It'll load up right there, and it'll push down until the whole thing flattens like a rabbit in a rock slide." His words carried a different weight than Mr. Finch's. The carpenter had doubted her materials. Abel was doubting her understanding of the enemy itself, the winter. He wasn't talking about carpentry, he was talking about physics and survival. He saw a fundamental flaw in her design that she had not considered. She looked at the gentle curve of the roof, and for the first time, she saw the flat spot he was talking about, a small section at the very apex of the arch. He gave a final, dismissive glance at her work. "You'll be burning wet wood by Christmas." He tugged the lead on his mule and continued on his way, disappearing into the timber without a backward glance. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, staring at the drawing in her notebook, the trapper's words echoing in her mind. The first snow came not as a storm, but as a quiet, wet promise. It fell for a day and a night, thick, heavy flakes that clung to every surface. It wasn't the blizzard Abel had warned of, but it was a test. Audrey had spent the last of her $10. 7 went to a massive sheet of tarred canvas from the Mercantile, the kind used for wagon covers. It was patched and stained, but it was waterproof. Another $1 had gone to nails and tin washers to secure it. The final cents were spent on salt and flour. She had stretched the heavy canvas over the arched frame, pulling it taut, nailing it down along the base posts. The structure was now enclosed, a long, dark tunnel. She had already begun cutting and stacking wood inside, a small but growing collection of dry pine and aspen. The wet snow accumulated on the canvas roof, and just as Abel predicted, it began to concentrate along the apex. The curve was not quite steep enough. Instead of sliding off, the snow settled, its weight growing with every hour. She heard a groan of protest from the wood. Rushing inside, she saw one of the central arches bowing inward, the green wood pushed past its point of tolerance. A pool of melted snow had formed on the outside, creating a dimple in the canvas that now held a growing slushy puddle, which began to freeze as the temperature dropped, adding more weight. Mr. Finch's words about warping, Abel's about flattening, they were all coming true at once. Failure was not an abstract concept, it was a physical sag in the roof above her head. She did not panic. She went outside with a long pole and pushed the heavy slush off the roof. Then she went back inside and studied the problem. The arches were working independently. The load on one was not shared with the others. The structure needed to be a single, unified system. Using the last of her cut poles, she began to install diagonal cross-bracing, running timbers from the base of one arch to the apex of the next, creating a series of triangles. Triangles were strong. She worked for 2 days, retrofitting the entire length of the structure. She nailed the braces into place, turning the frame into a lattice. When she was done, she went outside and looked at it. It was uglier, a web of poles visible through the canvas, but she knew it was stronger. She had listened to the wood and the snow, and they had told her what the structure needed. She had failed, but she had failed small. The real test was still to come. Winter arrived in earnest a week later. The sky turned the color of lead and the wind began to howl through the pines, a sound like a grieving animal. It was a 3-day storm, the kind that erased roads and buried fences. The snow was wet and thick, piling up in heavy drifts. Audrey remained in her small lean-to, its opening covered with a spare piece of canvas. The fire was her only companion, beside Sully, who lay pressed against her, a warm, living anchor in the cold. From her shelter, she could see the shape of the snow shed, its dark form slowly being subsumed by the white. She could hear the storm's assault on it. The wind tore at the canvas, making it snap and shudder. The weight of the snow produced a constant series of groans and creaks from the wooden frame. Each sound was a question, a test of her lashings, her bracing, her design. She imagined the joint straining, the green wood compressing, the nails holding fast against the pull. She thought of Abel's warning and visualized the snow loading onto the apex. She trusted her cross-bracing. She trusted the triangles. She slept little, waking at every new sound from the structure. The world was reduced to the small circle of her firelight, the sound of the wind, and the groaning of the wood. On the fourth morning, she awoke to silence. The wind had stopped. The world was utterly still, muffled under a thick blanket of white. She pushed aside the canvas flap of her lean-to and stepped out into a transformed landscape. 3 feet of snow covered everything. The pines were heavy with it, their branches bowed low. She looked toward the snow shed. It was still there. A long, white mound, like the back of a sleeping whale, rose from the landscape. The curved roof had done its work. While snow clung to it, much had sloughed off the sides, creating deep drifts along its length. The peak, where she had feared the load would concentrate, was a clean, wind-scoured curve. It had held. She shoveled a path to the entrance, a simple flap of canvas at one end. Pulling it aside, she stepped into the cool, dim interior. A cathedral of dry wood. Stacked cords of pine and aspen reached almost to the ceiling, a fortress against the cold. The air smelled of resin and dry timber. She ran a bare hand over the rough-sawn ends of the logs. They were cold to the touch, but utterly, perfectly dry. She picked up 2 pieces of split kindling and knocked them together. They made a sharp, high-pitched clack, the sound of readiness, the sound of warmth, the sound of survival. A week after the storm, a figure on horseback made his way slowly up the snow-covered track to her land. It was Mr. Finch. He didn't wave. He just sat on his horse, looking at the long, white shape of the snow shed. He had likely come expecting to find a ruin, perhaps to offer a grim sort of assistance. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and walked to the entrance. Audrey was outside, splitting logs with a steady rhythm, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She stopped and leaned on her axe as he approached. He peered into the dark opening, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw the towering stacks of wood. He walked inside, his footsteps silent on the dirt floor. He looked up at the web of cross-bracing, at the way the green poles had settled into their curves. He put a hand on one of the arches and tried to shake it. It was solid, unmoving. He said nothing for a long time. He was a man who spoke in the language of wooden joints, and the structure was speaking to him. Finally, he bent down and picked up a piece of split pine from the stack. He turned it over in his gloved hands, examining the grain. He tapped it with his knuckle, listening to the sound. He brought it to his nose and sniffed it. He was performing a carpenter's rites, an inspection more thorough than any words. He walked back out into the bright sunlight and looked at Audrey. He didn't offer praise or congratulations. That wasn't his way. He held up the piece of wood. "Wood's dry," he said. It was the highest compliment he could give. He mounted his horse and rode away. His validation was quiet, but it was real. 2 days later, another family appeared, pulling a sled. The Millers. Their faces were pinched with cold and worry. Mr. Miller explained that their woodshed, a traditional square structure with a flat, shingled roof, had collapsed under the weight of the first storm. Their entire winter's supply of wood was buried and soaked. They had been burning furniture to stay warm. He had come to ask if she had any wood to sell. They had no money, but he offered his labor in the spring. Audrey looked at his wife and two small children, huddled together on the sled. She saw their desperation, but also their pride. Charity would be another kind of wound. The sky remained clear for another week, a cold, brittle blue. But the old trapper's warning about a bigger storm lingered in Audrey's mind. She used the time to prepare. She cut more wood, stacking it inside the shed until it was nearly full. She reinforced the entrance with a sturdier frame of thick pine logs. She checked every lashing, every nail, ensuring the entire structure was as sound as she could make it. Then the weather turned. It began not with wind, but with a strange, heavy stillness. The air grew thick, and a pale haze obscured the sun. Sully became restless, pacing the perimeter of the camp and whining low in his throat. He could feel the change in pressure, the approach of something immense. The first flakes began to fall that afternoon, small and dry at first, then larger and heavier. By nightfall, it was a full-blown blizzard. The wind returned with a vengeance, a physical force that shook the trees and drove the snow horizontally. This was not the storm from before. This was the one Abel had spoken of. The one that broke the spines of cabins. For 6 days, the world disappeared. The storm was a living thing, a relentless assault of wind and snow and cold. The temperature dropped far below zero. Audrey and Sully stayed in the lean-to, which was now more like a cave, its entrance almost completely buried by a drift. She kept the fire small but constant, using the precious drywood from the shed. Several times a day, she would have to tunnel her way out to clear the entrance to the snow shed, ensuring it wasn't buried completely. The sound from the structure was terrifying. It was a constant symphony of stress, the high-pitched shriek of the wind tearing at the canvas, the deep, resonant groans of the wooden frame under a load that grew heavier by the hour. She could feel the vibration through the frozen ground. She pictured the snow piling on the roof, the weight compacting, turning to ice. She imagined the joints twisting, the green wood fibers screaming under the strain. This was the final exam. There would be no second chances. On the 4th day, a sound like a pistol shot echoed through the storm. She was sure a brace had snapped. She crawled to the entrance of the shed and peered inside with her lantern. The frame was holding. The noise had been a large, ice-laden branch breaking from a nearby pine. The structure was still standing, fighting its war in the dark. It was no longer just a collection of wood and canvas, it was a testament to an idea, a silent argument against right angles and convention. It was proof that yielding could be a form of strength. When the blizzard finally broke on the 7th day, the silence it left behind was profound. The landscape was unrecognizable, a rolling sea of white. Drifts were piled 10 feet high against the trees and boulders. Her lean-to was a small dark hole in the side of a mountain of snow. It took her 2 hours to dig her way out into the pale morning light. She looked for the shed. It was almost gone, just the very top of its curve visible above the immense drifts. The snow had buried it, but it had not crushed it. The structure had used the very thing that threatened it as a form of insulation. The deep snow packed around its base had anchored it, protecting it from the worst of the wind. She dug for another hour to clear the entrance. When she finally pulled back the canvas flap, she was met with the same scene as before, row upon row of perfectly dry wood, safe and waiting. The air inside was still and cold, but it was the cold of shelter, not of exposure. The frame had held. The curve had won. The Millers were in a desperate state. Audrey had seen the thin curl of smoke from their cabin chimney shrink each day during the storm, and on the last day, it had vanished entirely. She loaded a sled with as much firewood as she could pull and made her way through the deep snow to their cabin. She did not knock on the door and offer it as a gift. She proposed a trade. "I need help clearing the snow from my roof and reinforcing the fence on the west side of my property when the thaw comes," she said to Mr. Miller when he answered the door, his face gaunt. "I'll trade you this wood for your promise of 2 days' work in the spring." Mr. Miller looked at the sled piled high with dry pine, then at his wife and shivering children in the dim, cold cabin. He looked back at Audrey, and his shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened. He was being offered a wage, not a handout. "You have a deal," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He helped her unload the wood, and for the first time in days, the Miller family had a proper fire. The next spring, he was true to his word. As he worked alongside her, he studied the snow shed, asking questions about the joints, the bracing, the angle of the curve. He borrowed her notebook for an evening, copying her drawings onto a piece of scrap lumber. That summer, he built a smaller version next to his cabin. It wasn't as elegant as hers, but it was strong, and its roof was curved. The following winter, his wood stayed dry. The idea began to move through the valley, a quiet piece of practical knowledge passed from one neighbor to another. Years passed. Audrey built a small, sturdy cabin for herself on a flattened piece of ground she cleared above the creek. But the snow shed remained, its canvas replaced with salvaged corrugated tin, its wooden frame now cured by age into a permanent, unyielding series of arches. It was a landmark on her homestead, as much a part of the landscape as the granite boulders and the old pines. Other, similar structures began to appear throughout the surrounding hills, especially at higher elevations where the snow was deepest. They were called bow sheds or snowbacks. Most people didn't know where the design had come from. It simply became part of the local building vernacular, a piece of anonymous wisdom. Audrey never sought credit. The proof was in the dry wood, in the families that made it through the winters. Her notebook, filled with her neat script and detailed drawings, sat on a shelf in her cabin. It held more than just measurements and lists. It held the story of her first winter, a record of observation and adaptation. It chronicled the dialogue she had with the land, the wood, and the weather. One evening in late autumn, many years later, she sat by her hearth, the fire casting a warm glow on the room. Sully, now old and grey around the muzzle, slept at her feet, his leg twitching as he dreamed. She was burning aspen from the shed, and it caught quickly, burning with a bright, clean flame. She looked out the window at the long, curved shape of the snow shed, its metal roof gleaming under the moonlight. The first snows were once again dusting the high peaks. The shed was not just a building. It was a principle. It was the physical manifestation of an idea, that survival was not always about imposing one's will upon the wilderness. It was not about fighting the forces of nature with rigid, unbending strength. Sometimes, it was about listening to the shape of the wind, the weight of the snow, and the wisdom of a bent willow. It was about finding the strength in yielding, the resilience in a curve. The quiet dignity of that first winter had not been in conquering the mountain, but in learning how to bend with it.